Deine Alle Guten, alle Bösen, folgen Alle guten, alle bösen Folgen Assembly members, you know them well, but for the purposes of the live stream, I'm going to give them a proper introduction again. So we're going to hear from two panellists on the question of some of the key issues to think about kind of how we practically might achieve net zero. And so we'll hear from Chris Stark from Committee on Climate Change, obviously one of our expert leads you know well, and Professor Rebecca Willis, again, one of our expert leads from Lancaster University. So same kind of format applies to this panel as before. They're going to talk for about 10 minutes. At the end of the 10 minutes, we're going to give you a little bit of time at your table to note down any questions, but please do feel free to note questions as we go. Just a reminder that you have the red and yellow cards on your table. I think we might have missed a couple of red cards yesterday, so we'll do a bit better at spotting them today. But if the speakers are speaking too fast, then stick up a yellow card and they will slow down. If one of their points doesn't, if you're not quite sure what they meant, then put up a red card and they will stop and they'll repeat the points, hopefully in a more understandable fashion. So I think that's all from me for now, so I'll hand over to Chris to start off.
Thanks, Tim. Let's see if we can get these slides working. So, hello again, everybody. Now, I don't mind saying that this is the bit I have some trepidation about, so I'm going to try and, in this session, talk about the steps that lead to net zero. So yesterday, if you can imagine, when we were thinking about how we would plan the weekends, yesterday was really about climate change itself. So the science, some of the impacts that it's causing, and some of the more philosophical questions about climate change. Very deliberately, so we wanted you to understand that. What you'll be dealing with really from now on is the solutions, so the things that need to be done to reduce emissions and to get to that goal of net zero overall. So just to begin, net zero, and we'll keep repeating this, net zero, the goal means balancing completely the emissions that are released into the atmosphere with the various things that we can do to take them back out of the atmosphere, and we'll talk about that in just a second, and balancing them at zero overall. Hence net zero. So I will talk about in a second how that can be done, but I want to preface this by saying, I mean, this is the work that I do day in, day out, but I do not claim to be standing in front of you with an answer about this, and I want to make that very clear. What I'm going to give you is an example of how the UK might reach that net zero goal, and the reason I want to do it like this is because I want to give you a sense of how integrated this question is. So we've been hearing a lot about climate change and emissions, and that can be, you know, quite a difficult topic in and of itself. But the solutions have lots and lots of implications. So what I'll show you is an example of how the UK could get to net zero in as simple a way as I can. Mainly, it's about, rather than the kind of the strategies and the quantity of the things that I'll talk about, it's more about seeing how these things fit together. So that's what I hope I can talk to you about in the next 5 or so minutes. We're going to be talking about these three things: energy supply, energy use, and land use. And they're very broadly the topics that you will need to think about too. And we're going to, after this, we're going to take you through in the next weekends some of these issues in much more detail to allow you to make some decisions about the things that I'm about to tell you about. Okay, does that sound okay? All right, so let's begin then. So we heard yesterday lots and lots of things about what's causing climate change, so what's causing them, and in particular about greenhouse gas emissions. So the challenge is to change what we're doing at present to create those greenhouse gas emissions, and to change what we do at present to bring carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and to store it away. So that matters immensely because of these things: energy supply, energy use, and land use, which are utterly fundamental to the way that we live our lives in the UK. And I'm going to start with energy supply, and let's start first with electricity generation. Now, at the moment, because of the things that we've been doing over the last 10, 15, maybe even a bit longer years in the UK. At the moment, half of the electricity that's supplied to you, roughly, in any 1 year, comes from what we would call low carbon means. That's either nuclear power or renewable power. And don't worry, we'll talk to you about what that means in a second. But think about nuclear power stations which don't cause those greenhouse gas emissions, or wind power. So half of, at the moment, uses zero carbon, and half uses fossil fuels like coal and like gas. Now, this is what we talked about yesterday, if you remember the pie chart that I showed you all. So we've about 50% of the supply of electricity now at the moment is zero carbon. That, by the way, is a pretty remarkable statistic. Other countries around the world haven't achieved that level of, and this is a word you'll hear a lot about, decarbonisation so far. So that's something that the UK has already achieved, but it is not enough, not nearly enough to get to the goal of net zero overall. So what we need to do is to finish the job, if you like, and complete that task of fully decarbonised electricity production. Now I've used a windmill there. It can be achieved through wind, or it could be done through nuclear power. Please don't take that to mean that it's just wind that we're going to use here, but it's just an icon to try and demonstrate what we're trying to do here. So finishing that job of getting to fully decarbonised electricity. And then we have to think about all this stuff. And this is all the ways that we use energy at the moment, and the ways in which we use energy at the moment, by and large, involve lots and lots of use of fossil fuels. So at the top there, you see the buildings that we have in the UK. In broad numbers, there's about 30 million. And they are mostly heated entirely, actually, mostly from fossil fuels. And mostly that fossil fuel, the one that we use most, is gas, natural gas. We have in the UK one of the most extensive networks of gas anywhere in the world, and we've spent a long time building it and constructing it. So mostly buildings are heated from fossil fuels and from the gas system in the main. Beneath that, you've got the road transport system, the surface transport system, which is, I mentioned yesterday, the biggest single source of emissions when we look at all the bits of that pie chart. That's cars and vans. Then beneath that, you've got more vehicles. You've got heavy goods vehicles, trucks. You've got tractors, the things that you'll find on farms. And you've got boats, ships, all of which use fossil fuels to move around. And then at the bottom is industry. You remember that part of the chart that we showed yesterday, about a fifth of emissions overall. Now, that's how we use energy at the moment. We have to decarbonise those uses of energy through various different means. One of the ways we can do that is by having more clean electricity, so more low carbon, zero carbon electricity. In this example, we double the amount of electricity that is being produced in the UK from what we produce at present. And if we do that, then we can electrify many of the things that presently we use fossil fuels for. So let me just briefly explain what that means. So think about the top box there, which is buildings. 30 million buildings, mostly heated from the gas system. It is possible to heat those buildings using electricity instead of gas. And we can use things that you will hear about. I won't go into detail now. Things like heat pumps, which take energy from outside of the home, using electricity, create heat inside the home. We don't have many of them at the moment, but it's possible to do that. We can, something I'm sure a lot of you will have heard of, we can have electric vehicles on the road. So we can, at the moment, there are nearly 40 million vehicles on the road, and they all use petrol and diesel. In this example, they are all electric by mid-century, by 2050. And there's a dotted line here around the truck and the tractor, because some of those things we think could be electrified as well. So we could have electric basis for some heavy goods transportation and some machinery on farms. And some of the industrial processes can also be electrified. So it's possible to use electricity to create some of the process heat, for example, that presently that we use fossil fuels for. So we can use more electricity, and we can use more clean electricity to address these things overall. But it's not enough. So we also need something to replace that. And it's a fuel that can be used to replace those applications where we can't use electricity. And in this example, we're using a fuel called hydrogen. Now, hydrogen is the most abundant thing in the entire universe. It's, you find it very often in stars. It's everywhere, but it isn't found naturally as a gas. You can't just go out and find some hydrogen. So you have to go through a process to create it. And we do create hydrogen at the moment through an industrial process, but we do that by using natural gas in the main and turning it into hydrogen, releasing carbon dioxide, which is one of the greenhouse gases. So nothing's easy. So we can go through a different process to create hydrogen, and then we have a clean fuel that we can use in alternative applications. And in this example, that's what we do. So it turns green there. I'm sorry that the slides look like they've come out slightly differently. But there's an H hiding underneath that green circle, if you see it, H2. Now, green hydrogen just means hydrogen that's been produced without creating those greenhouse gases, and we'll talk to you about that too. But you can do that through one of two ways. One is that you can pass an electrical current across water, and you might have done that in school in your chemistry class. You create a gas that pops when you light it. That's hydrogen. So that's one way of doing it. We call it electrolysis. And the other way of doing it is to take natural gas and to turn it into hydrogen, but capture the carbon. And I'll talk to you about that in a second as well. But that doesn't then create the greenhouse gas that we were talking about yesterday. So that's hydrogen. If you have hydrogen, that's very useful, but we don't have enough of it at the moment to replace those areas where we can't use electricity. So in this example, we scale up the production of hydrogen tenfold, so 10 times the amount of hydrogen that we produce at the moment, and we do that all without causing those greenhouse gas emissions. And if we have that amount of hydrogen overall, we can then use it in a few other things in our energy use bit of this chart. So you can use it as a replacement in a boiler. You can have a different sort of boiler in your house. At the moment you have a natural gas boiler, probably most of you. You could have a hydrogen boiler instead, and we would pipe hydrogen to some homes in the UK in this example. Hydrogen can also be used in transport as a fuel, in what's called a hydrogen fuel cell, which is where you put hydrogen into the car. You don't actually burn it, it's not combusted. It goes through a chemical process, and it can create electricity, which then can fuel these things. And you can use it in industry as a replacement for, in particular, natural gas. So that's hydrogen. And what's also possible in industry is that you can keep burning fossil fuels but capture the carbon. So that's a process called carbon capture, and you then can store it. And that is a well investigated process, but we don't do it at scale at the moment. So it's possible to capture that carbon, then pipe it down into, in particular, where we used to have oil and gas reserves, and put it back under the ground where it goes into safe geological storage. Now, that might sound like a difficult concept, but we understand quite a lot about what could be done there. So we can keep using fossil fuels as long as we capture the carbon. Nearly at the end. There are some uses and some causes of emissions where we can't use hydrogen, we can't use electricity, at least not in any credible scale at the moment. And one of those is aviation. So we think that, particularly for long-haul aviation, there isn't an alternative to fossil fuels because you get a particular amount of energy from using that fossil fuel for, in particular, kerosene. And the other one is agriculture. So we talked yesterday about livestock causing greenhouse gas emissions. So those things sit there, and I'll just briefly go through that. So for those things that we can't then get the emissions down, we've got to think about what we can do to take the gases out of the atmosphere to replace it, to net it off at zero. So for that, we need to change how we use land. And to free up land, we also have to think about things like what we eat. So if we're going to use land in a different way, we need to think about doing less of some of the agricultural stuff that we do at the moment. We can plant trees, and they absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. That's roughly how many trees we plant at the moment each year. If we scale that, in this example, scale that up roughly threefold, this is compatible overall with the example I'm giving you here. So this is the amount of trees that we are planting in this example. And we can also do something on agricultural land, which is we can plant crops, which you can then use in energy. So you can burn those crops. They're called bioenergy crops. And we can use those for things like generating electricity as well, as long as we capture the carbon from it. So we can link all this up. If you can see that, you can see that we link the carbon dioxide storage with those bioenergy crops, and we can create energy and store carbon overall. And that has a use in other parts of the energy system as well. And the last thing in this example that we could play around with is the demand for the things left that still cause the emissions. So our use of, for example, planes, what we eat, so eating less of in particular, the livestock that cause the emissions, so red meat and dairy. And we can play around with that a little bit by demanding less and using less of those things that cause the emissions. This, in very broad outline, is an example of how the UK could reach net zero. The kind of proportions that you see there are accurate, and it's, of course, very deliberate. It's very simple and very deliberately so. But what I really wanted to land with you is how integrated, how interconnected, how connected all of these things are. So, in particular, think about something like land use. So it's not as simple as saying we need to grow lots of trees, although that would help. We also need to think about what we're not doing on that land if you're going to do that. Now, what we're going to do over the successive weekends is divide this stuff up into meaningful chunks to allow you to make meaningful decisions about some of these things. So what I've talked to you about is an example of how you could get to net zero. Other examples are available. So we really need to understand what you think about these things and what things you want to do more of and what things you want to do less of. And we'll give you as much information as we can to help you make that decision overall. But the challenge itself is one of the most challenging things that a country could ever set for itself. And the last thing I'll say is that is the implication of the net zero target that Parliament has now set for the UK. It is a huge mission overall. So thank you very much.
So thank you very much to Chris for that. So a couple of minutes now just to note down any questions on your table and pass them across to your facilitator. everyone. We're going to give you some time to look at your top priority question in a little bit, so you'll get to return to that conversation. But next up, we have Professor Rebecca Willis. So over to you, Rebecca.
Thanks. So you just heard from Chris about the changes that the UK could make to get to zero carbon. And the question that I want to address is how we might do that. Who would need to do what if we're going to reach net zero? So I'm going to be talking about the different groups and actors involved. So I'm going to cover in the next 10 minutes the different groups who need to act, and I'm going to look at central government and local government. I'm going to look at businesses and communities, and I'm going to look at individuals. And then I'm going to really focus in on what government can do, because it's your job as an assembly to make recommendations to Parliament. Now, government is sort of a part of Parliament. All the MPs who are in the government are also part of Parliament. So you will be having to think mostly about what politicians can do, what government and Parliament can do to get us on the path for net zero. So I'm going to focus in particularly on the role of government. But as I'll say, that's very much linked to what businesses and individuals can do. So I think a useful way of thinking about this is to say that getting to net zero will need action from all three of these groups. It will need action from government, central government and local government. It will need businesses and communities to do things differently, and it will need us as individuals to do things differently. And so let me give you an example. So travelling around cities. One of the things that, and all these things came up yesterday, but what I'm hoping to do today with this is really to consolidate what you were talking about yesterday and give you some work through practical examples. So if you're talking about city travel in a city like here in Birmingham where we are today, one of the things that came up quite a lot yesterday was what individuals could do in terms of, maybe cycling more or walking more if they're able to do so, using public transport or switching to an electric vehicle. Those are some of the things that individuals can do. There's things that businesses and communities can do to help people along their way. So businesses can provide bike hire, for example. Businesses put on bus services. Businesses might be able to provide electric taxis. And there are also things that government can do. So, for example, they could charge cars to enter the city, as London's done through its congestion charge. They could provide good bus services and maybe use public money to subsidise those bus services. And they can build cycle lanes. So these sorts of things have been happening in cities. And I don't know how many of you know Birmingham well, but I spent a couple of years in Birmingham as a child, and it looked very different to how it did today. And one of the reasons is that the city centre has been pedestrianised, and it's now easier to get around without a car. And that's a change that's happened in Birmingham. And actually Birmingham are going a bit further and changing their road system, again, to prioritise people on bikes. And so that's a concrete example, literally out of our window, of how these changes can be brought about. But the point that I really want to stress is that it's not about just one of these groups doing something. It's actually about how you can coordinate to make sure that everyone can play their part. So, for example, you might decide that you're going to get a train to work, because you don't want to drive anymore. Maybe you don't want to drive your petrol or diesel car, so you think, right, I'll get a train. But then you might find out that the train's more expensive, or there's not a train that could get you there in time. And certainly if you live in rural areas, you'll find that it might be very difficult to get a train. So you can't do much about that yourself. And the way that might change is if the train companies or the government change the way that the transport system is managed. So you might have the best intentions as an individual, and you find that you can't act because government or businesses haven't done something. So what what this triangle represents is a sort of change model which shows that if all of those players, government, businesses and communities and individuals have the right incentives, and if they're all motivated to make a change, then you can get that in place. So you can create city travel that is lower carbon and that makes it easier for people to get around, that also allows for people who might not be able to walk or use a bike, that provides a kind of transport system that allows people to get around the way that they want and which is also much lower carbon. But it's most likely to work if all three sides of that triangle are playing their part. And if you just leave it to one or the other, then it's much harder to act. So let me go through then, as I said, in particular what government can do. So there are lots of ways that government can help businesses and communities and individuals to get to net zero. And again, a lot of these came up in the conversations yesterday, so this is a bit of revision in a way. Government can provide information and advice. It can spend money and invest. It can change the price system through taxes and through subsidies. And it can regulate, it can pass laws to make something illegal. So I'm just going to tell you some advantages and disadvantages of both. And through doing this, I don't want to suggest that one route is necessarily better than another, but it's almost like I'm giving you a menu of different ways in which government can change things, and it's almost a menu that you can be having in your minds as you develop your recommendations. So information and advice, an example of that would be advice that some of you might have seen about how to save energy in the home. And the advantages of government providing information and advice is that it's relatively cheap. You know, you might have to pay for adverts or something, but it's not an expensive thing to do. And also, it doesn't force anyone to act. You're just providing advice and asking people to make decisions. Then there's no force involved. The disadvantage linked to that is that it can be ignored. And also, remember that triangle. It doesn't necessarily make it easier to act unless there are other changes as well. So the government might say, might give you information about energy efficiency, but if you find it too expensive or there aren't businesses that can provide you with those energy efficiency services, you're going to find it really hard to act. So that's the disadvantage of information provision. So government can spend money. Government obviously raises money through taxes. It can also get money through borrowing. And it can spend that on things which will help us toward less carbon. So, for example, cycle paths, or it can pay for you to insulate your home. It's done both of those things in some areas. So the advantage of this is that government tackles the problem directly. The government just goes out and does it for you, if you like. And another advantage is that it benefits everyone. So, you don't have to pay to use a cycle path. Government's provided it for you and you can use it. The disadvantage, obviously, is that it costs money, and that money either comes from borrowing or it comes from our pockets in the form of tax. And because it involves spending money, it might not be popular. It depends. Some taxes are popular, some taxes less so. So there's that sort of question about whether people will support it. And then another way that government can act is through changing prices, using the tax system to change prices. So an example here is fuel tax. So there is you pay tax, obviously, when you buy petrol and diesel. There's no road tax at the moment for electric vehicles, so you don't. The tax on electric vehicles is zero, and you pay road tax on other vehicles. So that's an example of changing the price system. The advantage of this is that it makes the zero carbon or low carbon alternative cheaper, and also that if you raise money by taxing fossil fuels, you can take that money and spend it on low carbon solutions, so you can change the way that the market works. The disadvantages are you'll need to think about whether it's fair to tax people, And what if there are no alternatives? So if you're taxing car use, but you live in a rural area where there's no alternative, is it fair to impose that cost across the population? Is it fair if people can't afford that tax? And obviously we all have different levels of income and some people might not be able to afford it. And what if there are no alternatives? You have to pay extra, but you can't make a choice not to. And as with government spending, it may be popular, it may be unpopular, and that's what politicians will try and think through. And lastly, regulations. This is where government just changes the law and says, right, you can't do this anymore, it becomes illegal. So an example is that a few years ago, government changed the rules on gas boilers in your home so that when you installed a new boiler, it had to be the most efficient type of gas boiler. And that just happened. Then boiler installers just installed the most efficient ones. And, it wasn't a tax or information or anything. It was just, right, this change is happening. That's happening now with, in 5 years' time, we won't be able to generate electricity from coal anymore. And, that's just the law. So the advantage of regulations is that it's quite simple. It's just saying you can't do it anymore. And it's very predictable. And it applies the same to everyone. So unlike taxes, so if something's taxed, then the richer you are, the more of it you'll be able to do. Whereas with regulation, that applies regardless of your income. You're just not allowed to do that thing anymore, or businesses aren't allowed to do that thing anymore. And it can be introduced gradually. So as with coal, we can say, right, in 5 years' time, there won't be any more coal generation. And that gives time for people to adapt, and it gives time for companies to develop new solutions. So you can signal that you're going to change the law, and that means that people and companies can then get used to that new situation. The disadvantage of regulation is that it might affect businesses, and this is particularly an issue if that business trades internationally. So, for example, if a company's making steel here and a carbon tax or energy tax is imposed on steel making, you can not buy your steel from here anymore, you could import it from somewhere overseas where it's cheaper to make steel. So there is sometimes a problem with regulation for that sort of business. Again, it might be popular, it might be unpopular, and that's a judgment a politician is always making. And you have to design regulations very carefully, because you can't ban something that there isn't an alternative for, or if you ban something very quickly, then it might be difficult for people and companies to adjust. So it has to be done quite carefully and over a long period of time. So the conclusion is that you need action from all these three groups, and realistically, it's not saying that government will do only one of these things. It's saying that to tackle any issue, it's going to need a combination of all those things. Thanks.
Thank you very much to Rebecca for that. So, a lot of information to take in again from both Chris and Rebecca. The purpose of the presentations today were to give you an overview of the sorts of different things that you'll be considering in the future weekends. So it doesn't matter if you haven't haven't remembered all of what they've said, because we'll be returning to those different points in much more detail in the next weekends, but just to hopefully give you a bit of an introduction to some of that material. So we're running a few minutes late at the moment, so what I'm going to suggest is that you now collecting your questions for Rebecca, but then move straight away into then picking out your top question for each of the speakers. Then we'll have a break, and then we'll go to the Q&A with the speakers. I'll introduce the break in a few minutes. So you have about, I think about 15 minutes now to pick out get together your questions for Rebecca, and then pick out your top question for each speaker.
nicht diese Töne, sondern lasst uns angenehmere anstimmen und Freude schöner Götter, Funken, Tochter aus Elis,
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for coming back so promptly. So we are on the final straight now. So time for a quick fire Q&A to Chris and to Becky. We're going to try and get through as many of your questions as possible in the time we have available. So we're going to be asking for some nice kind of snappy answers to them. I'm going to start off with one for Becky, and let's go for: can global trade negotiations take into account emissions?
Yes, they can. The push of what countries have tried to do up until now is move towards a system of freer trade where there are fewer barriers to trading between countries. So they're trying to make it as easy as possible to trade between countries, and that's generally seen as a good thing to promote free trade. What it is possible to do is for one country to say, okay, we're not importing your steel anymore, for example, because it's made with too much carbon, it's made using fossil fuels, and so we're going to charge you to bring steel into our country. That is possible, and it is being talked about, but it would be quite a change to the way that we've done trade. But it might be, if you end up with a situation where some countries are really forging ahead and with climate change and others aren't, and there's a big difference in prices between those two countries, it is something that countries might want to consider.
Thank you, Becky.
So, Chris, we had kind of a bundle of questions on carbon capture and storage, so I'll read them out and can answer them as a group. So, how much can it store? Can it escape? What are the implications of our waste underground? Where is the technology for carbon capture, including buildings and verticals, and what are the risks associated with it? What are the long-term outcomes and problems with CO2 storage? What are the advantages and disadvantages with captured carbon, and what do we do with it? Can it be reused?
So thank you very much, because so I'm very, very glad that these questions have been asked, because carbon capture and storage can occasionally look like the answer, and it may indeed be part of the answer, but it's not some sort of unicorn coming along to fix things. So there are well understood processes here that allow us to take a fossil fuel, use it, capture it usually in an energy process. So think about, for example, burning a fossil fuel, capturing the carbon, and then storing it. Now, each bit of that we can plan out. So the processes themselves are understood, but the scale of it that might be necessary is not so understood. And it involves us taking, as I say, a fossil fuel, going through some sort of process. You can think of natural gas, so the gas which if we burn it causes carbon dioxide. You can put that through a process called steam methane reformation, and you can capture the carbon that's inherent in it, and you have hydrogen at the end of that. Now, that's a process we understand. In fact, it happens quite a lot. The capturing of the carbon is a process we understand, and then the storage of it is the bit that we haven't really done at scale yet. Now, what we can do with that carbon is we can pipe it out as a liquid out into the North Sea, where we used to have oil and gas, and we can pipe it down into the depleted oil fields and gas fields that are there. It's particularly good to do that in a place where you have porous rock, so rock where there's lots of holes. And in effect, it goes into what we call geological storage. So it calcifies, turns into rock. So it's very safe storage if you can go through the process of getting it out there. And in the UK, particularly in the North Sea, we have a lot of storage, really quite a substantial amount of it. So if you can construct the right processes onshore to pipe the carbon out, the carbon to the storage sites, then it is potentially a very good solution overall. But there is clearly a cost to that, and there is then a question, which brings us back to some of the things that Becky talked about who pays for that and how they pay for that. So that's it's not as simple as saying there's an easy technological process here. It's the whole social and technological process together.
Great. So, Rebecca, you spoke about action by government, by communities and business, and by individuals. So the question is, which of the three groups would you say is the most important in making a change?
I would say it depends, and all three. So it does depend on the issue. So you can imagine, so that change that I said that happened with boilers towards more efficient boilers, that was government and business doing that. Individuals didn't actually need to change. Just when they got a new boiler, they got a new type of boiler, and you could do that more or less without noticing. So some things you can just sort of switch over. Other things, if we're going to reduce the amount we fly, for example, then that's something that affects anyone who might otherwise get on a plane. What I would say is that when you look at the evidence, it's very difficult to see a route to net zero without action from government, and that's what you as an assembly are considering, what government and parliament can do. And I think it's pretty conclusive to say that it won't just happen by businesses and individuals. If we carry on with the same regulations that we have at the moment and the same tax systems we have at the moment, it won't happen just by businesses and individuals changing their behaviour. We need government to play what you might call an enabling role. We need government to help that process along and make it easier for people and businesses to move toward net zero.
Okay, Chris, a couple on nuclear energy. Is this a dangerous process? Radiation. Nuclear power and electric car battery waste. Are we creating another problem? The side effects. Are there other solutions? Sorry. Yeah.
So whether you regard it as a safe process or not is, I think, at least partly a personal decision and a personal view. It is true to say that we have quite a lot of nuclear power in this country. Other countries have more. France, for example, has a fleet of nuclear power stations bigger than ours, and they have been operating safely. Constructing new ones is expensive, partly because you need to do it in a way that allows it to be a safe process. But your judgment on whether that's something you wish to see happen, because the risks of failure are large, of course, with a nuclear power station, is something I'm sure you'll want to reflect on. What's definitely true is that the process of generating electricity from nuclear power does create some waste, and the storage of that waste is another one of those implications of addressing the problem of climate change. So the alternatives the alternatives to nuclear power are that you can use renewable power, renewable sources of energy production, like wind farms. They have a condition that's less helpful, I suppose, which is that they work when the wind blows, and they work less well when the wind doesn't blow. So that's the advantage you get from nuclear power, is that you get a more certain fixed amount of supply. Although even on that, there are longer discussions to have about how predictable wind power is, and we think more and more that it is quite a predictable source of electricity generation in the future, particularly if it's offshore. So in all of this discussion, there are lots and lots of these trade-offs that I mentioned yesterday, and nuclear power's trade-off is often described as being one about safety and one about the waste that's produced.
So Rebecca, how can government get companies to invest in climate change solutions? What is the incentive for companies to work with government?
Okay. So can I have the questions? Thank you. How can the government get companies to invest? Well, it can make it, essentially it can make it cheaper for companies to do the right thing. So it can, particularly remember Paul Ekins yesterday saying that new technologies that might help us tackle climate change tend to be expensive to start with and then get cheaper as you go on. We've seen that with wind power, we've seen that with solar technologies, we've even seen it with things like electric bikes and electric vehicles. So what government can do is help businesses, particularly at that initial stage when it might not be profitable for them to put that investment into something that is still expensive. So government can offer help to those companies, and government offers financial incentives to companies all the time, so it can manage those incentives in a way that helps companies get over that first hurdle, if you like, until the costs of things come down. It can also help by changing the prices, like I said, by making it more expensive to emit fossil fuels, for example, and cheaper to use a low carbon alternative. So there are ways in which government can help business. What's the incentive for companies to work with government? I mean, one incentive is that they have to obey the law, and so government can put a law in place that businesses, absolutely have to follow. But it's also that if goes back to my first answer, that government can create the right environment for innovation and for companies to do new things which will help us to tackle climate change. And so it's in the interest of those businesses to be part of that process, part of getting us to net zero. And the trick for government is to make sure that it's profitable for businesses to do that, so that they want to be part of that, they want to invest in it, and that their shareholders will back it.
Okay, so do we have enough room for more trees and more wind turbines and grow enough food for us all? And as an island, what percentage of land would need to be planted with trees for this to be a solution?
Brilliant question, because this is one of the toughest things overall. So we are an island, and there is only therefore a fixed amount of land to do something with it, and we have lots of need to use land in different ways. In particular, agriculture. So we produce about 80% of the food that we consume here in the UK. So it comes from agricultural production, 20% imported. If we want to plant more trees, which might be something that you want to do if in a world where we're meeting the net zero target, we're going to have to free up land that's presently used for agriculture for something else. And there is enough land to do that, as long as there is a set of conditions in place for that to happen. One of them is that we'll need to deal with the emissions that come from agriculture, and we'll probably need to look at diets. Now, that's something that you will be discussing, and I'm not going to give you any answer to that, except to say that if diets do change, if we consume less red meat and dairy, then you have fewer livestock emissions to deal with. Agriculture emissions are about 10% of the total, if you remember yesterday when I showed you the pie chart. And about half of those emissions come from methane emissions, which is the digestive process of cows and sheep. And if you have less of that, you can do more of some of the other things, including planting more crops and also planting more trees. To get to the kind of example solution that I showed you earlier, involves us going from 13% woodland cover at the moment in the UK to something just under 20%. So that's the kind of change that you see in that example. But again, I'll make the point, other examples are available.
So we're low on time but high on questions. So can I ask for some really snappy answers to the next few? So Rebecca, you seem to focus on tax rather than subsidies. Can you offer further examples of potential subsidies?
Sure, okay, 2 examples of subsidies. One, I mentioned you don't pay road tax on an electric vehicle at the moment, so that encourages people to buy electric vehicles. Another example is that in the past the government has paid for insulation, paid for energy efficiency measures in houses for people who couldn't afford to pay for it themselves. So that subsidy comes out of taxes. I would say, though, that a lot of subsidies at the moment actually are in the wrong direction for zero carbon. So, for example, you pay 20% tax, that's VAT, on energy efficient products like insulation, but you pay a much lower rate of VAT on the gas to heat your home. So some subsidies are actually in the wrong direction at the moment. There are also a lot of subsidies for getting fossil fuels out of the ground in the first place. So some subsidies aren't necessarily helping us do what we need to do.
So sorry, I'm just going to ask a quick follow-up question, because it links to the first point you made, Rebecca, which is about the, I guess, the tax revenue that you can't claim from diesel. That you can't claim from electric vehicles. So if no diesel and petrol vehicles, i.e. all electric vehicles, where is the advantage to raise money to spend on other things? Tax revenue gone. It's about kind of raising a tax.
That is an excellent question, and if you have the answer, you might want to tell the Treasury. because they're not sure either. There have been, the revenues from fuel tax at the moment are quite high, and we need those revenues, for example, to fund the health service. So there are alternatives. One thing that's being considered is road pricing, so that you pay per mile travelled rather than paying for fuel, and that would pay for the road network, and it could also potentially pay for other public services. But I mean, they're genuinely, I'm looking at Chris, it's genuinely an open question at the moment, right?
It's a very open question, but in particular, fuel duty raises, I think the figure is £27 billion a year at the moment. Now, if we all tomorrow started driving electric vehicles, fuel duty would very swiftly start to dwindle. So that's money that's lost to public services unless there's a different way of raising that. So it's a really good example of how tricky it is to frame up the policies in government to make this transition work.
So hydrogen, the risks and effects of hydrogen, considering it hasn't been applied on not just such a large scale, and what are the implications in terms of causing an imbalance in the natural composition of our atmosphere?
So risks of hydrogen. Now, everyone at this point, well, not everyone, some people think of the Hindenburg at this point. And you're quite right to think about it, because hydrogen is dangerous stuff. The Hindenburg, though, is probably not the best example of the risks of hydrogen, actually, because it was the frame that you were seeing burning, actually, if ever you've seen that. Hydrogen is a fuel that we understand pretty well. We don't, however, understand how it would work at the kind of national scale in the same way that we do natural gas. So natural gas is what's piped into most people's homes at the moment through the gas network. So we don't know, for example, whether we could do the same with hydrogen in the same ways. So we do know that we need plastic pipes in the ground, and we'll need to have different things called compressors, which move it up and down the country if we're going to have that same supply of hydrogen. We understand some of that, but again, one of the questions is linking it all together. And the question of what implications are of so much hydrogen causing an imbalance in the natural composition of our atmosphere, we're much less concerned about that. So when you expose hydrogen to the atmosphere, it creates water, H2O. So it's one of the reasons why it's a thing that we can burn without too many worries about the greenhouse gas impacts. We do, however, have that safety impact to think about overall.
Okay, Rebecca, if we were to walk or cycle more, would infrastructure need to be planned differently to accommodate that? For example, closer hospitals and no more out-of-town shopping.
Yes, that would help if you compare between countries. If you look in the US, in America, where they've had much more spread out settlements, you actually need a car to get between your home and even the local shops. And where you might work, so they're a lot more car dependent as a result. So you can plan your towns differently, which would mean that you can walk and cycle. You don't have to suddenly decide that Birmingham should be rebuilt. There are ways in which you can move in that direction, but definitely I would say thinking about where you put houses, where you build new houses, that's a really important consideration.
Chris, how much methane do livestock produce in relation to humans?
Some people produce a lot of hot air, and two of them are sitting up here. I don't know the figure for that, but I'll say that I'll go back to the stat I had earlier, which is that roughly 10% of total emissions in the UK come from agriculture, and roughly half of that comes from methane from animals. So it's the livestock accounts for half of the total agricultural.
Rebecca, should we consider providing free public transport as an alternative to people using their own transport?
It's an option. You could think of it as a bit like the health service, free at the point of use. So it's free when you get on the bus, but it's obviously still not free to put that bus on. So the question there would be who pays, and that might be up to the city, or it might be a national policy, but you do have to find the money from somewhere. But I know where there's been experiments at making public transport a lot cheaper, not necessarily free, that has had a beneficial effect both in terms of reducing emissions from transport and also in terms of accessibility, because people who can't afford a car can get around more easily and cheaply.
Transport related to, what's the environmental impact of trains currently used compared to driving?
Another really good example of a tricky question. So it depends, and many of the answers to these questions is often it depends. But a train that travels via electricity, so that's one that has overhead lines, is generally very low in its greenhouse gas impact, and that's because the electricity that's generated to fuel it, to power it, is increasingly being decarbonised, as I mentioned earlier. Trains which run on diesel, much less good from the climate perspective. But overall, trains filled with people are generally better, regardless of what fuels them and powers them, than cars, which typically have fewer people in them. So it's still a really good strategy to build trains, even if they're fueled from fossil fuels. But of course, the best outcome from the climate's perspective is that those trains, in the end, are electrified, or possibly use something like hydrogen as power instead.
Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left, so we're going to speed up again. And if government raises tax on fossil fuels, will they use it on the environment? Would it be ring-fenced?
There have been examples of that. So one not exactly climate, but environmental example was there's a tax on landfill, which is rubbish that isn't recycled, and it now you have to pay a tax, or the waste companies pay a tax on waste that goes to landfill, and that money has been spent on local environmental improvements in that area. So you can do it. What government will say to you is that you can't be too tight about it, because there are some things that we need to fund as a country, like the health service, like pensions, like social security, and government has to find money from those somewhere. And so if you're too strict about saying, okay, tax this thing and it can only be spent on that thing, then that leaves government a lot less room for manoeuvre what they do overall. But certainly there's a strong idea that you should tax things like fossil fuels that you want to reduce the use of and spend it on promoting the alternatives.
Can we speed up the amount of renewable sources?
Yes.
Fab.
Fantastic. Rebecca, is it feasible to make all modes of transport electric? And what is the difference between the emissions of a car running from diesel or petrol versus the emissions generated when electricity is used to charge cars?
Okay. Make all modes of transport electric. Cars, yes, definitely feasible and done now. Goods vehicles, feasible but harder. Shipping, feasible-ish but harder still. Planes, we don't know how we'll do that, especially long haul. So it depends on which type. The electric vehicles have two advantages in terms of efficiency. The first is just that the engine itself is more efficient. It's, you get more energy out for energy in an electric car now than you would a combustion engine. So there is an efficiency gain there. And also because our electricity is now produced more and more from low carbon sources, that's another benefit. So there are two ways in which electric cars are better, even when electricity isn't entirely free of carbon, isn't entirely decarbonised.
What types of crops are used for bioenergy, and how does this work?
So another very controversial, difficult topic. We can grow a crop called miscanthus, which looks a bit like bamboo, and you can use that in the energy process. Or you can do something called coppicing, which is a technique in woodland management where you get the little shoots that come out at the bottom of the trees, and there are certain trees that produce a lot of that. So poplar is one of them, I think. And you can then use that in the energy process. So we call that short rotation coppice. That's because it grows quickly. So miscanthus and short rotation coppice are two of the kind of best routes to growing energy crops. But to make the point again, if we want to do that, we need to free up what's presently agricultural land that's being used for other purposes. So that's where the controversy comes from it. It's very useful if you have carbon capture and storage, because you can grow these things quickly, use them in the energy process, potentially then capture the carbon and store that. And that gets you some very quick emission reductions if you have the ability to do that overall.
Okay, so last couple of questions. Rebecca, will there be a Department of Simple Truth who will inform the public of the factual reality of choices and consequences before the political decisions are made?
What a question, and what a department that would be. I think it's a really good question. I would say that role has been played not by government departments but by organisations actually like the Committee on Climate Change, who sit slightly outside government. And I used to be part of a government advisory body called the Sustainable Development Commission, and its job was to provide government with the evidence they needed and to a certain extent to inform the public. So there are ways that government can do that. I think actually my suggestion would be that it's better if it's an organisation set a little bit apart from politics. But I suppose there's a challenge to you there, Chris, in terms of communicating to the public maybe about how we sort of lay the facts out on climate and other issues.
Great, so I think we're out of questions for Chris, but a couple more to go for Rebecca, so just in the hot seat by yourself now. So the health benefits of walking and cycling outweigh the benefits of insulation, etc., if money is limited. I think this, do they outweigh? So if you were to have to spend money in one place, which would it be?
The short answer is I don't know the question. I don't know the answer to that because it would be specific on the person. So I know that the health effects from particularly on asthma and those sorts of conditions are considerable actually from poorly insulated homes. There's very good evidence that walking and cycling brings, has huge positive benefits for health and savings to the health service. But which is best in health terms will depend on the individual probably.
So there's another one on making public transport free, which I think we've already covered, so I'm going to put that to one side. And so it means the last question is, if you want to say anything more about that one. The other question is, if we create regulations on household good use dependent on high carbon emissions, will this lead to international trade tensions and tariffs?
Okay, so I answered that a little bit before when I was talking about how countries trade with each other. It's not an issue if a household good is made in this country and sold in this country, because then that doesn't involve trade. But if you're thinking about goods that are shipped in, for example, most electronic devices are made overseas, then yes, if you impose a tariff on that, that could lead to trade tensions. I just did want to pick up, because something caught my eye on this, that's why, and it was about, is there a case for locally run transport? And so this was about subsidies for public transport, and is there a case for locally run transport? And I think it's a really important point to raise, because I don't think we should pretend that everything should be done by national government, sort of top down. A lot of this can be done by local areas and local government, and in fact local organisations. So maybe not even companies for profit, but maybe community groups or cooperatives could provide a lot of local solutions, and government shouldn't forget about those sorts of organisations that can deliver local solutions.
Fantastic. Can we give Chris and Rebecca a huge round of applause? So we're very fortunate that they'll be returning for future weekends as well, so we'll get to hear much more from them in the following weekends of the Assembly. But now, so before the break, before the panel, you were working on the principles that you thought should underpin decisions about how we reach net zero. And something that Rebecca or Chris may have said in the panel or the Q&A may have sparked some other thoughts. So we want to give you a few minutes now to think about whether there's anything that's come up since you developed those principles that you want to add to them. So we'll give you a maximum of 15 minutes to do this, but I'm going to come round to tables to check how you're getting on, because you may need a little bit less, so we'll see. So 15 minutes now.
Freude schöner Götter, Funken, Tochter aus Elysium. Wir betreten feuertrunken, himmlische dein Heiligtum. Deine Zauber binden wieder, was die Mode streng geteilt. Alle Menschen werden Brüder, wo dein sanfter Flügel weilt. Deine Zauber durch des Himmels prächtigen Land laufen Brüder eure, von laufen Brüder eure, von freudig wie ein Held zum Siegen, wie ein Held zum Siegen laufen Brüder eure, Mutter aus